So if you happen to have been present at our annual meeting last Sunday, you heard me talk about this growing population of individuals who identify themselves as spiritual, but not necessarily religious. I had a conversation with one such person not that long ago. She was telling me that for her, her church was a mountaintop. And her prayer was hiking. And I have to say, I get that. I mean, coming from New Hampshire, where I have stood on some of the most spectacular peaks and looked at the most dramatic of vistas, I get that those places can be holier than any bricks and mortars and stained glass that we might put up. I get that. And I get that when we're hiking, we can fall into a conversation with the divine that can be deep and profound. I really do. But since I was invited into this exchange with this individual, I said, but let me just say that actually there's some benefits to church too. I said, our worship holds such beauty. There is such power and comfort when we say our prayers with others. There's such help when we sort through scriptures together. There's such beauty when we sing songs together. I said, the Christian church can be a wonderful experience. Well, she was into sparring back and forth, which was great fun. And so she said, yeah, I get it, but also when Christians get together, they do things like, the Crusades. And when Christians get together, they somehow find a way of making the Holocaust sound like God's idea of a good time. Or even cite scripture to justify the works of the Ku Klux Klan. She said, and more recently, it's been Christians who have covered up abuses in the church. It's been Christians who have shamed the LGBT community. And I'm listening, and she's kind of getting whipped up, and then she said, as if to really drive home the point, she said, and the Pope wears $500 slippers. That was tough. Well, we went back and forth on all of those points, and I won't tell you about all the things that we said, but I will tell you, well, I did say to her, well, just to be clear, he's not my Pope. But in all seriousness, I mean, that conversation stayed with me, because that conversation did reflect the reality that we so-called Christians, we have a credibility problem with some people out there. We just do. Because they see a big gap between what we are talking about and doing on Sunday and how we behave to others these days of the week. The first lesson that we heard today from Isaiah, at the heart of that lesson is a disconnect between worship and prayer and between action. That's what's going on there too. So this story of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, there are actually multiple authors, but all attributed to this one voice, the prophet Isaiah. And in this particular passage that we hear, Isaiah is giving voice to God's concerns. And Isaiah is talking to the worshiping community, who by all sort of exterior sort of markers seem to be pretty faithful, seem to be pretty religious. They come to synagogue worship on a regular basis. They say their prayers. They do their fasts. They even walk humbly. They seem to be pretty good religious folk. But God sees them differently. God knows that even though they might fast, they do so for their own personal benefits. God knows that even though they might say their prayers, they then go out and they quarrel with one another, even strike one another. And God knows that even though they might walk humbly, they then go back to their farms and they oppress those who work for them. And even if it's hard to hear in the reading of this Isaiah, if you go back and if you unpack the words, you find that there is a stinging condemnation here. That Isaiah is saying, look, you can't just pay lip service and not follow up with action. There is no righteousness to that. Isaiah says, such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. God needs more than just that. And he goes on. What does God need? What does real fasting look like? Well, what kind of fast pleases God? This is what Isaiah said. To loose the bonds of injustice, to let the oppressed go free, to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, to cover the naked. That is what righteousness looks like in Isaiah's eyes. That's what God expects of the religious faithful. Not piety, but practice. Without action, there can be no righteousness. Tough stuff. So I have to tell you, I read this and I thought about it, and I took a step back and I thought about our life here at St. Luke's. I thought about you all, and you know, I hope you'll forgive me for indulging in a little bit of self-congratulation, but I thought, you know what? I think that St. Luke's is doing a pretty good job on this. I think that you all, we say our prayers and our worship is certainly beautiful, but then actually we go out and we turn that worship into action. We heard about that last week at the annual meeting, whether we're talking about the Christ Community Kitchen, the supper that happens monthly, or the lunch on the hill, or now our recent ministries with Dorcas International. You know, I gotta say, I think we're doing hard work. And I look at you sitting in the pews, and I think, man, there are a lot of you who show up on days besides Sunday and who are putting your prayers into action. And that feels good. And in fact, I was just about ready to turn my attention from Isaiah's reading to the gospel, to sort of search the gospel out for something about what I might preach, when I read one last commentary on Isaiah's reading, and it stopped me in my tracks. Because this scholar talked about how oftentimes we misunderstand the audience for Isaiah, that oftentimes we see and understand the audience to be sort of a personal audience, or even just a smaller audience. But that actually, Isaiah is not speaking to the individual. He's not talking about individual practice. He's talking about the practice of the entire nation. He's talking about corporate practice. Not just how you live in your life, but he's saying to all the people of Judah, how are you forming your nation? I read that. At the same time, I'm reading about what's going on in our nation, in our country. At the same time that we are wrestling in our country with decisions from the government to restrict the refugees that might come into this country for a period of time, and to refuse entrance into this country from 7 particular countries on the globe. I'm reading this Isaiah passage and I'm thinking about our nation. And I'm having amazing conversations with many of you all. And it gives me pause. I got to tell you, I feel so fortunate to be a part of this parish and to have conversations with you all. I so appreciate your thoughtfulness. And the comments have been all over the map. Some people have said, look, other countries also guard their borders. We can't just have open borders because if we have just an infinite amount of people coming into our country, our economy and our infrastructure won't support it. Someone said to me, well, we've got to be mindful of our safety and our security. And these 7 countries are countries that are a hotbed for terrorists. Someone said to me, wait a second, these travel bans, they disproportionately impact Muslims. There's some real discrimination against Muslims as you look at this, someone said to me. Someone said to me, I'm concerned because the people that we're going to be turning away are the people that are fleeing violence, are the people that are suffering from oppression, are people who are homeless, who are starving, and we're going to be turning these people away. You can see the comments are all over the map. And I have to tell you personally, I understand them all. I understand and can't even disagree with the concerns behind them all. So what are we to do as people of faith? What are we to do? What are we to want for our nation in which we live? I wasn't ordained when we went through the Vietnam War. I wasn't ordained when we went through conversations about civil rights. So I can only imagine how hard those days were. I think we're heading into days not that different. Days when there is no escaping that the challenges that are going on outside our doors are challenges that are profoundly faithful. They're not just political, they're faithful. And the question is, how do we as people of faith walk forward? I don't have a clear answer in terms of what we should be doing regarding refugees and regarding the latest executive orders. But I will tell you that as people of faith, we certainly need to lean into the scriptures, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, the Gospels, which speak time and time again about our care for the poor, our care for the oppressed, our care for those suffering from injustices. They're all over the scriptures. Exodus says, you shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien. Deuteronomy tells us, cursed be anyone who deprives the alien, the orphan, and the widow of justice. And today Isaiah says, to loose the bonds of injustice, to let the oppressed go free, to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless and poor into your home. How we move forward, however it may be, it has to be with an ear and a reading of our scriptures. It also has to be with respect and tolerance and understanding and attention to one another. We're going to be at this work for a long time, I think. The questions about refugees aren't going away. The struggles about terrorism aren't going away. And so when people say, so what can we do? Here's where I want to start. I want to suggest these things. As Christians, at the very least, I think we are called to understand the other. To know and understand the other. Whether that other is across the street who thinks differently from us, or whether that other is around the globe who looks differently than us, and who talks differently than us, and who worships differently than us. As Christians, we are called to know and understand the other. As Christians, we are called to care about the suffering of the human family. God's family, the entire human family. We are called to be engaged and to care and respond to the suffering of the human family. As Christians, we are called to resist fear. To resist fear. Because fear seduces us into a narrowness of thought, into self-absorption, into judgment, into demonizing. As Christians, we're called to resist fear. As Christians, we're called to read our sacred texts, to look to our scriptures, stories that were written thousands of years ago, but still speak to the same kind of challenges that we are encountering day after day, time after time. We can hear God's voice in those stories from then, and they can still speak to us today. And as Christians, we are called to pray. Is that going to give us an easy answer? Is that even going to help us all come to the same conclusion? No, it won't. But at the very least, if we can do those things in these days and weeks and months and years to follow, if we as Christians can do those things, then just maybe those people who say that they're spiritual but not religious will know that Christians are about a lot more than a pope with 500